Terry, are you ready?
Yes.
Okay. I expected a few more people. Hopefully they'll get on here in a little bit. But anyway, I guess for everybody that's on, I want to thank you for being on this evening. My name is Patrick Davis, University of Missouri Extension Regional Livestock Field Specialist. And like I said, I want to thank you for being on this evening. We're going to talk about warm season grass cattle grazing. And I've got Terry Halleran on here. He's our he's an agronomy field specialist, regional agronomy field specialist at MU Extension. And he's going to present first, talking about warm season forage options and talking about warm season grass development and management. And then I will be talking about cattle nutrition and grazing management on warm season grasses. And just a couple of things before we get started here. We've got the chat button. That's probably the best way. If you have questions, more than happy to answer questions. And we'll take time during the meeting to ask and answer questions as well. But one of the best places to put those questions is in the chat button down at the chat there. And you can click on that and type the question in and just send it to us, and we'll get that answered as best we can during the meeting. Also, during the meeting, if you would keep yourselves muted, so we cut down on the background noise, that would be helpful as well. And also a couple of things that I sent to you before the meeting started. Terry's been having some internet issues, and so I wasn't able to get his presentation sent to you before the meeting, but I will get it from him after the meeting and send that to you. And I also sent my presentation to you. And then within that email, I also sent a link to the evaluation. We'd like for you to please fill that out after the meeting tonight. It's a Qualtrics survey. You just click on it and fill it out and submit it, and it comes back directly to me. It's anonymous, and so you please fill that out after tonight. Sure like that. Also, trying to think what else there is to. I think that's probably all I can think of right now that we need to talk about. But yeah, just throughout the evening, if you have questions, put those in the chat, and we'll try to get those answered. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Terry and let him go.
Thank you, Patrick.
Yep.
Just a quick check. Can everyone hear me? Would somebody respond and say that the voice level is right? I don't have any way of checking that. So can y'all hear me?
I can hear you fine.
Okay, so I've got a confirmation.
Yeah.
Well, this is a presentation that basically I stole from Tim Snockenberg and from Pat Miller, but there's no reason to really reinvent the wheel. The information we need to talk about is here. It's just in the manner in which I look at it as compared to Tim, as compared to Pat. But probably the first and most important reason you're listening tonight is you're missing something in your grazing system, and you're trying to figure out what you can do to adapt or change. I would say the biggest hole we have, obviously, is our summer slump. We're trying to avoid feeding a lot of hay. We're looking for answers where it's a lot easier to drop a wire and move cows than it is to start hauling a lot of forage in. And warm season grasses has become a big push in our state for that. So I'm assuming most of you coming from the state of Missouri are going to be cool season based, and you're predominantly going to be fescue based. There are some reasons for that. You see here we have fescue, orchard grass, brome grass as listed as some of the cool season grasses. There's perennial ryegrass, there's reed canary grass, there's other choices out there that grow. And then obviously the two big clover groups is red and white. And we refer to these as cool season because they predominantly grow in the spring, early summer, and in late fall. Otherwise, it's too hot and they don't do real well. What causes us to be fescue dominant? The reason we brought fescue to this state was because it was tough. We could eat it to the dirt. It could go through a major drought. And if we had a little rain and a touch of fertilizer, it would come right back. You can't say that about orchard grass or brome grass or some of these others, because if they're grazed too tight, you lose them. But we're not here to talk about a rotational grazing system tonight. We're here to talk about warm season pastures and warm season hays. When we begin to look at the warm seasons, there is a wide selection that we can look at, everywhere from Bermuda grass all the way down to the Lespedeza. And we'll touch on all of these. So what do we know about Kentucky 31? What do we assume? Well, I gave you a couple things. One, it's palatable. They'll eat it. They like it, especially when it's young and tender. They prefer to graze it. I've already touched on its durability. Eat it to the dirt, starve it for water. Got good resistance as far as insects and diseases. And you just can't freeze.
Why can't I hear this?
Terry, I accidentally muted you. Can you unmute yourself?
What is the last thing you heard?
Start about durability. In that
Okay.
area. Sorry about that.
Well, durability, we've touched on the grazing. You can eat it to the dirt. We touched on the drought, that it can stop raining and it'll just sit there. It'll be dormant, but when it starts raining, it'll come back. It is fairly disease and insect resistant. We do have the army worm walks across our fields every now and then, but it's pretty tough and you can't freeze it out. We get two pretty good grazing seasons. We get the spring, early summer grazing season before it gets too mature and then goes dormant. And then we get the fall and into early winter. And some of our winters here lately have been rather mild. And we're actually seeing the tall fescue growing longer and lasting longer. It's probably one of the easiest to establish, and it is probably one of the most available seeds out there. If you're living in Southwest Missouri, you're in one of the largest fescue seed producing areas in the United States. We combine a tremendous amount of Kentucky 31. So what's the downside? We are very aware that we have a condition now known as fescue toxicity. Fescue toxicity, when you look at what the animal goes through, it doesn't matter whether it's in the winter or the summer or whenever it's there. There's certain time of the year that the toxicity is higher, and there are things that we can do to make it higher, like when you fertilize fescue at higher than 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen, you're probably going to increase the toxicity level. But again, if you don't put fertilizer on, you don't get tonnage. And a lot of people want tonnage. Well, what basically happens when a cow has fescue toxicity? Well, number one, its body temperature goes up. It's got a fever. Second thing is, if it doesn't feel good, it doesn't eat as much as it should. And the third thing is, if it's not consuming, it's not gaining, or it's not producing a lot of milk. If you're talking about a cow-calf operation, the fourth impact of that would be if your cows aren't milking like they should, the calves aren't getting that extra milk, the rate of gain is being affected. We also know that the animals have a tougher time maintaining body condition because of that. And that also goes back to fertility and conception rates and things like that. So we got a problem with fescue. We like it because it's tough and it's always here. We don't like it because of the toxicity. Some other things that affect us with fescue. A lot of people that mow, rake, and bale hay fight this battle every year. When it's time to make good, cool season grass hay, the weather is absolutely terrible. You can't get that window of time to get it mowed, raked, and baled in a dry condition. That's one of the reasons we came up with these wraps, so we can wrap bales with higher moisture to get them off the field. But usually what happens is people stall it off, and we end up cutting too late, and it gets too mature, too weedy, protein content is down. And in reality, if you've got people coming in and mowing and raking and baling for you, they're going to stall you off as long as they can for two reasons. One, they want to get theirs put up first. And the second is they get paid by the number of bales produced by acre. So they're not really concerned about putting up quality. They're concerned about putting up quantity. And when you get that wrapped up into a bale, it's really difficult to see what's inside it. So, that's some things to think about when we're dealing in the fescue industry. So is it time to have a different idea? Is it time to look at some different possibilities? We started addressing this by going to different states that didn't grow fescue well, but yet they had cattle. And you start saying, well, what are your cows grazing on? How are they doing on that? So this set forth that situation where we started saying, are there other options? Is there something else we can do? We may not want to completely eliminate our fescue, but is there certain times of the year where, when it's really not the most desirable forage, can we find something else to put into our system that would work? Well, when you look at the yield curves and you look at the cool season grasses versus the warm season grasses, if you're thinking about Bermuda grass, you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck, obviously in July and August and September. Well, that's kind of when fescue's playing out. And you probably have some neighbors or some farmers in your area that have already begun to look at Bermuda grass as an option. There's a big push for crabgrass. And I have people ask me, well, what's the big difference between crabgrass and Bermuda grass? Well, one's a perennial, one's an annual. But the big difference is crab dust doesn't put out the tonnage that Bermuda grass does. But the other side of that is, if you don't feed Bermuda grass, it ain't going to yield. What about Caucasian blue stem? Another good option, another good choice, perennial. But seed is very difficult to come by. And if you look at how that fits into the cool season grass curves, if you could see behind the green, the white, and the yellow, you would see a big dip where your fescue goes dormant during the hot, dry periods. And the Bermuda grass, Caucasian, and crabgrass, and other warm season grasses, they're growing. And they don't require near as much water to grow as you would think. So let's look at some of the options here. Let's talk about Bermuda grass because it's kind of popular. Grows through August, can be used as a hay or a pasture. I will caution you that if you use it for a hay, it needs to be cut early because it really gets low quality when it gets mature. And Patrick can talk to you about that. It is also a situation where, since it's a warm season, and if you go through the process of taking it off as a hay and getting it mowed down to 4 inches, and you're thinking, well, what am I going to do now? You can drill cereal rye right in it. And since that's a cool season and it's an annual, sometime when the rye gets big enough during the winter months, you could turn your cows back in on that and let them take that off, and then get your cows off in time to allow the Bermuda grass to kick back in when warm weather comes. You know, you're moving your cattle away from that summer slump due to fescue when you're grazing Bermuda grass. It does extend the grazing season. This is a field that was drilled with Bermuda grass, and you can see that it's coming up pretty good. Now, it's going to take a little while for that to get really established, and one of our biggest mistakes is a lot of time people will turn cattle out onto these grasses before the root system is really established, and they'll literally rip it up out of the ground. Bermuda grass, this looks like this, will spread rather rapidly, but in reality, you need to be checking that root system to make sure that it can withstand grazing, because if you're not careful, you'll damage it. So why do we want to bother with maybe Bermuda grass? Because it's an excellent option for droughty situations. It does prefer a little bit better soil, but if we have one of those years where the drought is on, you may not get full production for Bermuda grass, but you're going to get some production from Bermuda grass. And, you know, if it's harvested at the right time, cows are going to eat it. Now, that is one of the things we've talked about already. When Bermuda grass gets mature, seed heads and stemmy, cattle don't like it. They don't like it. So you gotta learn how to graze this at the right time. It dilutes down or eliminates endophyte toxicity. If you have in your pasture system just 25% of your pasture in warm season grass and roll them through the rotation correctly, you can really reduce the endophyte toxicity. And it does complement your cool season grass pastures and hay as a place that you can move your cows to while those cool season grasses need to rest. So I have people say, well, okay, it's Bermuda grass. Well, what does it do for me? Well, some of our research has shown a 2-pound daily gain on calves. Our research has shown anywhere from 3 to 5 tons of forage that can be baled. Now, when we talk about cool season grasses, our normal range is 2.5 to 3.5. That's what we can normally get. Whereas with Bermuda grass, we can go above that, moving towards 5 tons. Now, you notice right under that, it says you got to feed it. It must be fed. And Bermuda grass loves nitrogen. And there's a lot of people that have access to poultry litter. And poultry litter, if it's good quality poultry litter, is well worth the money, especially with the prices of fertilizer today. And poultry manure also has some other benefits as well as fertility. So you're seeing a lot of these guys with Bermuda grass putting 2 and 3, sometimes 4 tons to the acre. I will caution you that your ground can only take so much. So I would be very leery about getting above 4 tons to the acre, because then you've got a possibility of a lot of that running off into the water source. What are some of the drawbacks? Well, one of the biggest drawbacks we have of any of our warm seasons or anything that we do is when you take a field out of production, and obviously you probably need that field because you need that production, it's going to have an effect on your grazing operation. So then the question you have to ask yourself is, when I take this out, and it has to be out for a period of time, am I going to have to decrease cows? Am I going to have to rent ground? how am I going to figure a way to make sure that I still have enough forage to feed my stock when I put this into a warm season grass? And that's a concern. Okay, that's something you got to think about. So this might be the year that, or a drought year might be the year that you back your cow herd off a little bit and then go in and do some adjustments with warm season grasses like Bermuda grass. All warm season grasses are expensive. I know it says it varies. I'm telling you, all warm season grasses are expensive. It costs money to establish these. But, it's kind of like looking at other things. You get what you pay for, okay? You get what you pay for. There is a threat of the Bermuda stem maggot. We did see that last year. It goes into the base of the Bermuda grass and it grows in the stem. And then obviously anything above that stem maggot dies. So you'll see your field turn yellow. That's a real indication you got a stem maggot. It can be fixed with chemical, just like you spray the alfalfa weevil and alfalfa. But the first thing you got to know is whether you got it. And the second thing you got to do is the timing. Cutting it for hay can make it too short. You have to be careful because it's a warm season grass not to scalp it. Some people have a tendency to not want to adjust the shoe on their mowing machine when they go from cool season to warm season. But you need to think about that. The digestibility, when it gets tough, not so good. Not so good. Some of the research we saw at the Southwest Center down in Mount Vernon, steer performance was good while it was grazed, but they noticed a lower intake and the gains changed when they were put back on tall fescue in the fall. It was kind of a shock thing. The system got cleared out and then they went back on that toxic fescue. If you've ever bought cattle from out of state or from places where they're not grazing on fescue and you bring them here, I think Patrick can tell you some wonderful stories about how they just actually melted because they really need to be used to fescue. Otherwise, they have to go through a process of getting used to fescue, and that can be rough on them. And again, I told you, Bermuda grass is a heavy feeder of nitrogen. We're looking at 100 to 200 pounds of the acre to kick this stuff to make it go. Now, I've already told you, if you get above 40 pounds to the acre, 60 pounds to the acre on fescue, you end up with a endophyte problem. Well, there is no endophyte problem in Bermuda grass. It's not associated with Bermuda grass. So I can kick this up to 100, 150 pounds the acre and not have to worry about that. So could it be a game changer for you? Well, it's not a perfect solution, but it is an option. Okay, it's an option. If you're thinking about doing it, you might want to visit with some guys that are doing it. You might want to ask to watch them turn their cows out on it and see how they graze it. You may want to try to figure out how you're going to plant it. Sprigging is really good, but really expensive and hard to get seeds. Seeding rates are extremely high. So again, whichever way you go is kind of expensive. But having a warm season forage gives options to most producers that don't currently have an expanding grazing opportunity for the summer. So that's kind of what we look at when we look at Bermuda grass. Here is some examples of what you can do. There's cow grazing on fescue, and then on the other side, there's a cow grazing on Bermuda grass, and they're making hay on Bermuda grass. You hear a lot of people talk about Caucasian blue stem. I had a good friend who got his master's degree on Caucasian blue stem. He's pretty good at it. He knows what to do. And I visited with him, and he said it's very, very difficult to get going. He says what normally happens in a Caucasian, and for that fact, a lot of your warm season grasses, the first year you plant it, you're going to have a weed infestation that you're going to think, oh my goodness, this is terrible. Don't panic because the grass is there. It's coming. Okay. We have chemicals out there that you can control those weeds with, which will not hurt your warm season grasses. So don't panic. It's coming. One of the quicker ones to establish is Caucasian blue stem, but don't look for it to be there until the second year with any quantity. Okay. It is one of those that will grow on a poorer soil, and that fits well into a lot of our Ozark situations when people are kind of hesitant to put a lot of high dollar fertilizer out. It does not like its feet wet. So if you're thinking about putting this down in the bottom along creek bottoms and places where the soil is a little higher quality, if it has standing water, if it has a high water table, forget it. It won't be there. Okay. It is one of the warm season grasses that works well in the fescue belt. There's another option which we can throw out. There are some grazable alfalfas that are out there, but there's also some baleable alfalfas that are out there. A lot of times alfalfa is not treated as a pasture, but it is treated as a crop. But again, is a situation where you can take a piece of ground and get enough production off of that through hay that if your cows are looking kind of tough, or if the weather, like we had this last winter, when we get that week or two of extremely cold temperatures, and your old cows are eating fescue bales that were not really baled at the right time and have low quality, especially for you guys that are fall calvers, those cows are really needing a kick. And alfalfa might be something that you might want to think about as a warm season option. You get 4 cuttings. Remember, 4 cuttings on alfalfa if it's managed correctly. There's nothing that has better quality, and it is an excellent supplement for low quality hay, as I've said. Puts great gains on your beef cattle. And I have a lot of people say, well, it costs a lot of money to do that. Eldon Cole, who has been in extension for a very long time and is very well respected, has wrote an article talking about when does it pay to buy alfalfa and skip the corn. And, with grain prices going like they're going right now, there might be something to that. When you start figuring out the price of protein as compared for corn as alfalfa, and Patrick could go into a lot better detail than I can in that, you might be surprised. It may make that equipment more understandable and justifiable. Make sure when you plant alfalfa that it's Roundup ready. Just don't do anything else. Pick a variety that's Roundup ready first, and then try to select varieties that work well in your area that have the right disease resistance that you need to be working on. Here is an example of a nutrient removal chart. I really like to put these in because it's really hard to get people to understand that when you take a product off the ground, cattle take product off the ground. Cattle are nutrient movers. They eat it, they move over here, they defecate it back. The P and the K pretty much stays. But if you're removing it from the field, if you're taking it away from the field, then the nutrients in that are leaving. This simple chart shows you that if you're taking 4 tons to the acre of alfalfa, you're pulling 44 pounds of phosphorus and 212 pounds of potassium off that year. That's huge. And if you don't take the time to put it back, you can expect production to be greatly affected. And don't forget, alfalfa is one that we have to watch the trace mineral of boron. We talk about, splitting applications at the first cutting, applications at the third cutting. We can also talk about, there's a certain time of the year that you don't cut your alfalfa, late September, because it has to have the ability to build up a root reserve to overwinter and come back next year. Now, when it's frosted on and it turns that yellow color, you can run the cows in there, but just be careful to pay attention to bloat, feed bloat guard and things like that. And again, that's Patrick's field. We also have to be aware that there are some pests that affect us, the weevil, the leafhopper, and also we can talk about weeds. But, all of those, if you can identify when they become a problem and when they approach the economic threshold, can be controlled. We have chemicals that will control the problem. So, are you up to the challenge? If you are, do you have the right equipment? Are you willing to mow, rake, and bale 4 times a year? Have you got dollars for fertility? Do you have a place to store this because you really don't want to get your best hay rained on? So there are challenges to using alfalfa, but I just wanted to throw that out as an option. Well, what are some other options? Crabgrass. A lot of research being done in crabgrass, especially Oklahoma, Kansas, places like that. Annual crop. A lot of people, if crabgrass grows pretty much in your yard without you inviting it in, that ought to give you a pretty good idea that it's really not hard to get established. Crabgrass is one of those things that's pretty easy to get going. And there's some varieties out there. The old variety, excuse me, the Red River crabgrass is good, but there's newer varieties out there. RL has done a lot of research on some of these varieties. There's Big and Quick. There's Big and Quick Spreader. There's some other varieties out there that are doing real well. When are you going to utilize this? Well, in the hottest time of the year, July and August. Great time to be grazing crabgrass. Very digestible, very palatable. You'll notice that study there from Oklahoma. The average crude protein is 17.6 if grazed at the right time at 60.4 TDN. Now, folks, that's tremendous. That's right up there with alfalfa. It's a reseeder. Once you get it established and manage it correctly, you don't have to seed it anymore, okay? There is possible some winter grazing if you do it just like Bermuda grass and go in there and graze it off at the right time, get it short, and then come back and drill your cereal rye onto it. You'll get a double grazing out of that pasture. But then again, make sure that you don't overgraze or punish it too much, because it will greatly decrease next year's production. It has to have the ability to go to seed. We've talked about some of the varieties there. One of the drawbacks to some of these newer varieties is it's very difficult to get them to go through the seeder. They are very hairy. So, you know, Big and Quick has a smooth seed coat, whereas Red River has a very rough seed coat. So you have to, if you're going to drill this, you're probably going to be using a drill that is actually set up as a warm season grass drill. An example here on Red River, in the legume box, you can mix 5 pounds of seed with 25 pounds of cracked corn, or with pelletized lime, basically a 1-to-4 ratio, to get it to fall through a regular no-till drill. But you got to pay very close attention to make sure the seed is flowing. Get off that tractor and check a lot to make sure that seed is flowing. And just because you're seeing fertilizer in the rows doesn't necessarily mean it's dragging the seed with it. Our rate to sow, 4 to 5 pounds per acre in the month of May. You can see it coming up, and this is basically a pretty good stand of crabgrass, okay? Good crabgrass stand started with light tillage in late April and early May. What do we mean by light tillage? Well, we burn it down with Roundup, and we may run over it one time with a disc with not much angle on it, drill it and roll it. Annual ryegrass. Annual ryegrass is one of those, it's a blessing or a curse. People in the dairy industry, they seem to like annual ryegrass quite a bit. But once you get annual ryegrass established on your place, you're going to have an extremely difficult time getting it off. It has a tendency to just stay forever. Another one, annual Lespedizas. In February this year, I applied annual Lespediza. Now, we're not talking about Cerisa Lespediza. We're talking about annual Lespediza. Korean and Kolb, okay? I put it on with red clover, Alsite clover, and Lespediza in a mix and frost seeded it in. I'm kind of curious to see how that's going to work in my pastures. I too am looking for something that the cows can graze in July and August. So the seeding right here, if I was just going to throw annual Lespediza, would be 10 to 15 pounds, okay? When I combined it with red clover and Alsite clover, I basically divided that up and I had 2 varieties of red clover. So I throwed 5 pounds of one red clover, 5 pounds of another red clover, 5 pounds of Alsite clover, and 5 pounds of annual Lespedeza. And that was a 20-pound per acre sowing rate, what I did. I don't know whether that's right or wrong, but that's what I chose to do. But if you were just going to use just Lespedeza to fill in that warm season during the summer, 10 to 15 pounds. Throw it in last of February, 1st of March in our area works real well. It will grow on the lower pHs. Now, I didn't say 5 or 4 5. 5.2, 5.3, 5.4. It'll tolerate that if there's some fertility. Okay. Keep in mind that this is an annual, just like crabgrass. It has to reseed itself. So if you don't protect a certain part of your farm during that period and allow it to reseed, then within a few years, you will have grazed all the Lespedeza out and you'll have to sow it again. That's the same problem we have with red clover. Very difficult to get people to allow red clover to reseed itself because you run your cows through it and they eat the flowers off and it never gets a chance to reseed. Red clover is what we call a short-lived perennial. It lives for about 3 years. So within 3 years or so, you notice your red clover is pretty much non-existent. That's why you see guys every 2 to 3 years will go out and say, well, I think I'm going to throw some red clover. I seem to be losing my red clover stand. Well, yeah, because you ate it out. That's why you have to reseed it. We don't have that problem with white clover. It's just a heavy year-round reseeder. So that's some of the bigger ones, but yet we still have other warm season grasses. Now, the term native, okay, crabgrass is introduced, Bermuda grass is introduced, ryegrass is introduced. What does that mean? Basically, what that means is we have found that cattle like it and they will eat it. So let's bring it to Missouri and see if we can grow it. Well, in the areas where it grows without much management, it's native. It grows in those conditions because those conditions are pretty much set up for them to grow. But when you bring it to our state, you have to do some management, some fertility, some things that will help it because it's not native. Native warm season grasses are adapted to the current conditions we have now. If you want a good example of that, watch alongside the highways as you drive, and you'll see switchgrass and Indian grass and big blue stem growing in the wild. And a lot of times growing very well. And you're like, how does it do that? You know there's no fertilizer going on. You know that that ground is not in the best shape because when they built that road, they tore that ground to pieces, packed it back real hard. But yet, here's these warm season grasses growing. It's because they're native. They're used to the adverse conditions of Missouri. So here's the normal tall fescue curve. Big production this time of year in the spring, dip, another production in the fall, and we're trying to fill in this hole. Well, what if we filled it in with switchgrass? Now, switchgrass can grow in wet soils. It works real well. It can grow in wet soils. How about big blue stem? Now, you notice there's a little bit of a different growing zone. Another one I could have put in here would be eastern gamagrass. Eastern gamagrass comes earlier than switchgrass, but it's still a warm season grass. Well, what about Indian grass? It's a little later. So if I was to maybe blend switch, big blue, and Indian grass together, I could probably have a pretty good production in the hot time of the year. Now, sometimes I don't like mixing switchgrass. I like mixing big blue stem and Indian grass. Keep in mind, all three of these are very tall, so they will have a tendency to shade things out. I would not be mixing Caucasian blue stem in with this because it wouldn't compete very well. These are the tall grasses. And when you look at grasses, we actually rate them as short, medium, tall, okay? Another one that could fall into this would be Johnson grass. Some people just hate Johnson grass, and other people just love Johnson grass. And, there are times when Johnson grass can create problems with nitrates, but I have run across several farmers, especially those that have ground next to the river in the bottoms that floods a lot, and they just give up trying to stop Johnson grass. They just wait till the summertime comes and turn the cows in on it, and they do very well. So that would be another one we could probably throw in the native warm season. But in our state, Johnson grass is supposed to be controlled. Now, there is the act of God law that says, if it's something that you obviously cannot control, like river bottoms, they're not going to bother you. But again, cattle like Johnson grass. So let's talk a little bit more about each one of these. Switchgrass comes in a little earlier than Big Blue. It's going to grow about 3 to 5 feet tall and adapts well to wet sites. It does have a tendency to get stiff and stemmy. It is fairly aggressive and competitive. It needs to be grazed in the lush state. What does that mean? Well, really, that's pretty simple. All of these warm season grasses, switchgrass, Big Blue stem, and Indian grass, need to be grazed at 3 feet of height. If it gets taller than 3 feet, it's going to start getting stemmy. It's going to start getting tough. So you need to turn them in on it when it gets to be 3 feet. You better get them in there, and you need to take them off when it's about 10 inches to 12 inches tall. So basically, you got about a 2-foot zone in there of a tremendous amount of furrowage that you want them to eat. Now, if I have a 30-acre field of this and I open those gates and I let all my cows in, they are not going to eat that evenly. They're not going to do what you want to do. So you're going to need to have a wire, a poly wire or something where you can portion this off to those cows and make sure that they consume it in a short enough amount of time that they'll eat what you want them to eat and then move them on, which works real well in a rotational grazing system. There are some different varieties listed down here that we have recommended. What about Big Blue stem? Probably more drought tolerant than switchgrass is Big Blue stem and Indian grass. Blue stem is one of those that's a little harder to get established. And again, switchgrass seeds are slick and easy to sow. Big blue stem and Indian grass seeds are hairy and they're harder to sow. Okay. You can get some pretty good production, but again, this is a 4 to 6 foot tall plant. When am I grazing this? 3 feet of height. Get them cows on it at 3 feet of height. If you're going to hay it, when am I haying it? 3 feet of height. But if you're going to hay it, raise your shoe up and don't cut that any closer than 6 to 8 inches. Because if you do, you're going to start damaging the growth of it. Warm season grasses need double the amount of stubble left as cool season grasses to be able to survive from mowing. And that's a problem we see a lot because people just absolutely refuse to take that 15 minutes to raise that mowing machine up and drop that shoe. They just won't do it. I'm not going to do it and you can't make me. I'm not trying to make you do anything. I'm telling you that if you mow your warm season grasses, especially these tall ones, like you do your cool season grasses, you won't have warm season grasses very long. You'll kill them out. And there are some varieties down there that you can look at. Eastern gamma grass. Really like Eastern gamma grass. Does a tremendous job. Really hard to get established. You have to buy quality seed. You actually plant with a no-till drill just like you're sowing corn. It is actually basically grown just like corn. It has the same nutritional fertility requirements of corn. And cattle love it. Now, you can see the gentleman standing in the picture, how tall it got. At this height, you could turn the cows in on that. They would still graze it. They would still work it very well. This one has a tendency to have a very lush condition, even when the seed heads come on, just like corn does. Indian grass, the latest one to come on, usually 2 to 3 weeks later than Big Blue stem. Indian grass is more of a clump, bare spot, clump, bare spot. It doesn't yield the tonnage. That's why we like to mix Indian grass and Big Blue stem together. Where the Indian grass grows and leaves a spot, the Big Blue stem will fill in. Indian grass also has a tendency to not be very persistent if it's not treated correctly. So you have to kind of watch how you deal with Indian grass. We've already talked about the mixtures, Indian grass, switchgrass, Big Blue stem. We've talked about the fact that they're tall and they'll shade out most everything. We've talked about how to mow them. So even at that, I would probably focus more on an Indian grass, big blue stem mixture. I might throw a little switchgrass in there, but I kind of like my switchgrass stands to be pure. So what about using annuals? What about those years where all of a sudden we have this drought and we need an emergency feed? What in the world can we do? Hayes went to $100 a bale. We've seen that before. And it's like, Jiminy Christmas. My fescue's playing out because I've ate it to the dirt and it's not growing. And now I'm trying to figure out, well, I punished it so bad, it's so weedy, it's so messed up. Maybe I need to renovate. Maybe I need to do something different. This would be a great time to think about putting in a warm season grass, maybe. Okay, so what could we possibly slide in? Well, there's a process to putting in a perennial warm season grass called spray, smother, spray. And this fits into it real well. What we do is we go into an existing field where we've decided that this is not going to get it. It's not any good. It's played out. I need to clean this up. So I'm going to kill everything. So you burn it down with Roundup. Maybe you burn it down twice if it's tall fescue to make sure you get it. Then you go in and you no-till drill a annual warm season. Pearl millet, brown midrib, something like that, with the intent to graze it or even hay it. But during that warm period, you get that growth. You have something that the cows can be turned on to and utilize, knowing that it's only going to be there one season. And then you're going to turn around and spray, burn down, clean it up one more time, and then go back with the next type of grass that you're going to use that's a cool season. Now, you can also use the spray, smother, spray system to establish warm season. You'll burn it down in the fall, plant wheat or barley or rye, run that through its system, graze it, burn it down again, and in June, come back and plant your warm seasons. But that's what we use an annual crop for, and we can still get grazing potential. Obviously, if it's not going to rain, then you're going to see problems with forages growing. You're going to see seed heads develop early. You're going to see things get stemmy. In the warm season grasses, especially if you put any type of nitrogen on them, you got to be very cautious of nitrates. We can test for the presence of nitrates with a very simple test. We simply split the stem, drop sulfuric acid on it, and it turns blue. But we cannot tell you the level of nitrate poisoning. And that's where you have to really get cautious, and Patrick will probably talk to you about nitrate poisoning and nitrate levels. And we also know that if it gets dry and the grass is struggling, that's when our endophyte goes through the roof. So what are the growing seasons of the warm season annuals? Well, there's Sudan grass. You notice it'll get you all the way through the summer, either multiple grazings or grazing and haying. But when it gets frosted on, it's done. There's pearl millet. It'll get you through the whole season. Okay. There's crabgrass as an annual, where people will put it in and take it out before it gets a chance to reseed. So what about pearl millet? Yields about 5 to 7 tons to the acre. Really drought tolerant. Foxtail millets usually provide you only one harvest. A lot of your millets, pearl millet including, from the time you put it in the ground to the time you can do something with it seriously, 45 days. 45 days, you can go back and drill it again. So you can get 2 plantings of pearl millet in the summer if the weather cooperates any at all. 45 days to maturity. Sudan. If you're going to plant Sudan, seeding rate about 30 to 40 pounds if you're going to broadcast, 20 to 25 pounds if you're going to drill. I strongly recommend that you drill. Broadcasting does work, but you still have to have seed to soil contact. So I would really rather see you drill it. You want to drill it in May. We're going to put nitrogen to it at about 40 to 50 pounds per acre when we plant. And then after we cut, we're going to put another 40 to 50 pounds on again. It can be grazed, it can be cut. Usually that's done, you notice 2.5 to 3.5. I'm telling you, 3 feet. These warm season grasses, these warm season plants, 3 feet, you need to be doing something with them. Okay. And again, it says leave that 8 to 10 inches of stubble, which requires you to move the shoe on your mower, and you'll get regrowth. Okay. Do not graze if it's less than 24 inches tall after frost because of the chance of nitrate poisoning. And we also have to be aware of prussic acid poisoning. There's a wonderful stand of Sudan ready to graze. That's not quite 3 feet, but within 6 inches of it, I would say. And that is a tremendous amount of forage, warm season forage that would be available for your cattle. Can you imagine what that would look like as a fescue field in late July? Because that picture's in late July. Pearl millet, 20 to 30 pounds broadcasting, 15 pounds drilled. Once again, sowed in May. Same type of fertilization, same type of grazing management. Now, we have had some experimentation here lately up north. We actually have a full presentation on this. Stockpiling grain sorghum as a winter grain and forage. And they're showing results of 300 to 500 cow days per acre. Excuse me. It's planted just like you were going to combine it. It's fertilized just like you were going to combine it. And what you're going to let it do is go through its growing sequence. You're going to let it get frosted on and die. Make sure you pick a variety that has great standability, is resistant to lodging. And then you're going to strip graze your cows through this in the winter months, only allowing them to have enough that when you turn them in within a 20 to 30 minute time period, every seed head should be removed. That is equivalent to 8 to 10 pounds of grain for those cows. Within the next 3 to 5 hours, they will strip the stalks. They'll leave the stubble, but they'll strip the stalks. And then you move the cows the next day. Now, it does require you to move the cows every day. But if you set this up correctly, they're seeing, especially for fall calvers, excellent condition when the cows come out of the winter. And calves are gaining close to 50 pounds more by doing this. And there is no prussic acid concerns because the plant's dead. And that's what it looks like. And you can see the cows immediately tack the seed heads. And right in front of that cow's head, you can see a polywire where they're only getting enough that when they eat today, and then tomorrow they'll get another strip. And you can see how they did this. Even in the dead of the winter, when you have 10 inches of snow on the ground, it doesn't affect you because the seed heads are way above the snow. So if you have the ability to do this, this might be something you might want to look at and maybe catch that presentation that Rusty Lee puts on. So where do we go from here? Well, you begin to ask yourself, do I want to do it? Number one, how much of it do I need to put in warm season to start with? And you go from there. So, if you're going to look at maybe 10 to 30% of your grazing system, I would say that's way plenty to start with. I wouldn't even remotely consider going more than 30%. So if you got 100 acres worth of grazing out there, you're talking about 30 acres of it being renovated, which leaves you 70 acres for your cows to be on, okay? Keep in mind, each one of these warm season grasses will have to be managed for its best potential. Also keep in mind that it's going to take, considering the type of grasses that are there, crabgrass is fairly quick. But you can really think about a 2-year cycle. You're going to be in a 2-year cycle to get this stuff well established. And then after that, it should be ready to go from then on if managed correctly. So here's an example. If you had a rotational grazing system and you had 10 paddocks, 8 of those paddocks would be cool seasons and clovers, cool seasons and lespedizas, okay? And then 2 of them would be warm seasons. Maybe of those, maybe that's 100 acres there. So 10 acres is in a warm season perennial, big blue stem and Indian grass. And 10 acres is in an annual, like crabgrass. And you notice you've caught some lespediza in there. And that gives you an excellent grazing opportunity. So unless anyone has any tremendous questions, I hope I kind of give you an idea about warm season grasses, the warm season grasses that work for us in our area, kind of an idea of what it's going to take to get them established. Um, it is a process. You are not going to be able to do this without chemical. So if you're one of those organic individuals, then you might as well forget this, because you're going to need to use that chemical and use it correctly. But if you go through the proper steps, within 2 years, you are going to see a tremendous amount of tonnage. And I will end on the tonnage question by saying cool season grasses under normal production will yield 2.5 to 3.5 tons to the acre per year, whether you graze it, whether you hay it, whatever you do with it. And that is in the ideal situation. If your farm is not in the ideal situation, then it's not going to yield 3.5 tons to the acre. It's not going to do it. You have to fertilize and you have to have it set up for maximum yield to get maximum yield. On the other side, warm season grasses. You're going to get anywhere from 4 to 5 tons per the acre. That's going to accomplish in 4 months, where your cool season production is going to be in 7 months. And there's an advantage for a 7th month, but you get it quicker. But again, that's if you fertilize and manage it correctly. But keep in mind, if it's a native warm season, it's going to take less fertility and less management because it grows here naturally. So would you rather be fertilizing 100 acres to get to 3.5, or would you rather be fertilizing the 70 acres to get to 3.5 and then fertilize the 30 acres to get 4 to 5? And that's my presentation this evening. Patrick, if there's any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them.
I guess we'll open it up for questions. Does anybody have any questions? I don't have any in the chat, but does anybody have any questions for Terry?
If you've got a warm season field next to a cool season field, will one of them take over the other one, or how do you keep them from spreading?
Probably not. I've not seen very heavy encroachment of any kind based upon management. Couple of things. If I'm grazing that cool season grass down to 3 inches, 4 inches before I move them, okay, it's really not going to be that aggressive to go over to another pasture. If I am grazing my warm season grasses down to 3 or 4 inches, fescue is going to encroach because I'm going to kill the warm season grass. But if I graze my warm season grasses correctly, because they're so tall, they will keep the fescue out. They will shade the fescue out. So I've not really seen real, I mean, there's going to be that gray zone. Yes. There's going to be that 20 or 30 feet where it's going to, but generally speaking, no. Especially if you're mowing, raking, and baling any of that, no. You're going to control that growth habit with the cows or the brush hog or the mowing machine.
Okay, thank you.
Is there any other questions for Terry? Seeing none, I think what we'll do is take about a 5-minute break, a little bit of a break, and then you can get you a drink or do whatever for a few minutes, and then we'll start up with the second talk tonight. And so with that, I'll be back with you here in a few minutes. Yeah, Terry, I got your message. Yeah, if you can and you can watch the chat or watch for questions or something like that, that'd be fine.
That's what I thought I'd do. I just want to make
Okay.
sure you do that.
Yeah, that'd be fine.
I'll do it.
If that works, if you need to go, that's fine too.
No, I don't need to go, but I didn't know whether you want me to watch the chat. I'll do it.
Okay, sounds good. So here, give me a second. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and start again. You said Terry did a good job kind of going through the different forages and actually some of the stuff I've got in my talk, he's already covered, and so we'll probably just focus a little bit more on the grazing side of it and the cattle grazing side of it. And I guess my first question is, can you guys see the full slides? I have the right view because I had an issue with that the other day.
No, you need to put it on full view.
Okay, let's see here.
We can see the slide you're presenting, and now we can't see nothing.
Okay, I'm gonna see if I can't fix this. Okay.
That's it. Click it.
Okay, and
That's
so
it. You got it.
okay, we're on the right slides now.
Yep.
Okay. I had some issues with that the other day, and so anyway, so I'm gonna kind of focus on the nutrition, more of the cattle grazing part. I've got some stuff in here and about some of the stuff Terry already covered, but just to kind of where we're going to talk about basically cattle grazing and talk about natives, introduced warm seasons, annuals, and warm season legumes, and then cover Lespedeza and alfalfa, and then kind of talk a little bit about the nutrition throughout. Mostly stick to grazing. There is a little bit on haying, but this presentation tonight, all this is being recorded, and I will. That was one thing I forgot to mention earlier. It's all being recorded, and so I will send that out to you. I will send that basically the way that you received your links to the meeting. That's how you'll receive the video link. It'll be a YouTube link, and I will get that done tomorrow and get that sent to the CVent group that sent you the links to the meeting, and then they will send that link out to you. And if you want the video link and you don't receive it, let me know, and my contact information's in the slides that I sent you and everything. And so just let me know and I'll get that to you. But just kind of a brief intro on this and basically why warm seasons, and Terry kind of touched on this, but basically they grow when our cool seasons are not growing. And some of these perform very well in drought. And we saw that in our most recent drought where pretty much everything was burning up, but our natives, because of their deep tap root or their deep root, can still grow well in those drought conditions. And during the time of the year when these grow well, they're much more nutritious than our cool season grasses. And why not? And there's some reasons. I think one of the things that you need to think about with warm season grasses is definitely, and I didn't put this in my slides, but is what your cattle operation is, and your return on investment. And do you have the cattle, the type of cattle operation that needs the quality of grass the time of year when these warm seasons are really growing and really nutritious and high quality? You have the cattle to utilize those. And or do you not? And that would be one of the questions asked, as far as why or why not would we incorporate these warm seasons into our grazing system. We've got length of time and persistence. You've got to manage them different than the cool seasons for them to stick around, and we'll talk about that here in a few slides. And then they do cost money, and you're going to get about 4 months of grazing out of them in most instances. Now, Terry did mention about, well, we can put some cool season annuals into some of those and those pastures and get grazing during those times of the years as well. But these particular grasses, you're probably going to get at best probably about 4 months out of them. And the thing about it is, if you want to, like I said, incorporating these into your grazing system, we need to have cattle that require these high quality nutritious grasses at the time of the year whenever they're there. Or does it really pay for us to do that? And I think if you're spring calving, these will be my opinions. If you're spring calving, there's some benefit probably to some of these warm seasons in there. If you're running stockers, there's probably definitely some benefit there, because as we talked about earlier, grazing those cool seasons, that you get much better performance on those calves, and you're basically raising those calves on gain. I think there's some benefits there. Now, if you're just a strict cool season calving operation, unless you're wanting to retain those cool season calves, wean those and retain those as stockers, I wonder if we really need, because typically during the summer months, we don't have that's probably the lowest nutritional need that those cool season calving cows have. Now, you could say, well, it does help from calving and process there, but as we move into when we calve those cows, but this might not be something that you necessarily need in your system, but that's main thing is look at your operation and what your do you really need that warm season grass, quality grass at that time of the year, and does it pencil out for you to put that in there? And so those are things to think about from a why or a why not standpoint. This is just a quick slide and why our warm seasons work during the summer months, optimal growing temperatures, and our legumes in there as well. During the warmer months, we're going to see better growth out of our legumes probably in our warm seasons versus our cool season grasses. So, and then one of the things that we've already talked some about is grazing height, and I'll mention that a little bit more, but especially start talking about natives here in a few slides. But root structure is very important on these grasses, and it's really important on any grasses. And the thing about it is what is on top of the ground is equal to what's below the ground. And basically management and those kind of things, if we manage them properly on top of the ground, we're going to have a good root structure. And especially with these natives, we need to graze them higher. And we talked about Terry talked about this, but we've got to graze them higher. The natives and all the warm season grasses, we need to graze them higher. And part of the reason for that is so we can develop that root structure down below, and that root structure helps when it's hot and it's dry, and they can still pull nutrients up, and they can still pull water up, and they can still grow. And so, but I would even say with your cool season grasses, you need to manage them properly, because if you knob them off to the ground all the time like that, you see that picture there it's my left that I'm looking at here in the screen, but you see that picture there where that grass has been knobbed off to the ground the whole time. it doesn't have any roots. And when you have a drought come along or a stressor of some sort come along and there's no root structure there, that forage isn't going to persist very well. It kind of leads into this slide here. One of our normal management strategies is take half, leave half, and kind of comes into this slide here when we talk about root growth. And the fact of the matter is that if we take too much of that leaf away, that stops our root growth. And if we stop our root growth, then we have issue. Then we have this picture like I showed here on the left side that I'm looking at here, where there's no roots. And so that's something to keep in mind too, as we're grazing is, and I'll kind of go through a scenario a little bit later in natives based on forage production. But when you're grazing these grasses and stuff, you need to keep a minimum height in there, and in a lot of instances, take half, leave half's a good management strategy from that standpoint. And so we look at benefits, and Terry kind of mentioned some of these, but basically for warm season grasses, they grow, they provide good summer production, they help us with our endophyte problem, and they are growing and they're in the right maturity for good hay production at the time when it's better favorable weather for haying. If we manage them right, they can be adapted and they can persist. Our natives have some wildlife benefits if you're in that business or have that interest, hunting and things like that. They can provide some benefit there, and that also leads to some benefits from a cost share or from receiving some grants or some cost share to incorporate those into a system. And one of the things down here, a lot of these slides came from Mark Green, who retired from NRCS. But basically, by incorporating some of these warm seasons in, they saw a 38% higher season-long average daily gain compared to tall fescue, compared to having a tall fescue grazing full season. And we'll actually see some Missouri data on performance from some stuff that like I said, a lot of these slides came from Mark Green, retired NRCS person. And we'll see some data from some data that they collected from some various grazing trials. And so we look at just our natives. They provide some good wildlife habitat. They're adapted. As Terry was mentioning before, they don't require the nitrogen, they don't require the fertility, but you do have to manage them differently. You have to give them more rest. They'd have to be grazed higher. As I mentioned, cost share opportunities because of the wildlife benefits and those kind of things, as well as other things. There's interest and push to have more native warm seasons around, and they do better in the summer. And this is compared to our introduced warm seasons we'll talk about in a little bit, but they do better in the summer really in droughty conditions because they've got that deeper root, and you need to manage them so they keep that deeper root. And so that's the reasoning behind why we need to graze them a little bit higher. And because they've got that better root system, they're less sensitive to climate changes and things like that. So Terry kind of already showed this, but it kind of just kind of push home the point. In a lot of instances, our switchgrass and our Eastern Gamma has its issues in getting established. It takes a little longer than some of these others. Switchgrass kind of comes on a little too early, probably for what we need to fill in our cool season grass hole, as I would call it. Some people call it summer slump. Some people call it different things, but basically our cool season grasses don't grow very well from June to September is basically, so call that the cool season grass hole or wherever. And big blue stem and Indian grass kind of fit real well, and those are kind of the grasses from what I've heard fit real well into our production systems and fill kind of that cool season grass hole that we have. And so, like we said, switchgrass. And one of the things that you'll see with a lot of these warm season grasses is, and this was data that was collected using manure analysis actually, and gains, and there's more of a prediction, but basically with a lot of these warm seasons, and I'll actually show some data later out of Tennessee. You're normally going to get somewhere around 2 pound a gain. That's common. I know that we'll see some data later with Caucasian blue stem, probably a little lower than that. We'll see some data that's a little lower than that, and you can see here, quality wise, best quality on the switchgrass is around late May. This was Missouri data that they used, but and we'll see some data later here as far as how that moves. But it's very competitive, very aggressive, likes wet areas. But as I mentioned, oftentimes it's a little too, it doesn't really fit our cool season grass hole near as well as, say, blue stem or Indian grass. Eastern Gamma, probably its biggest issue is getting it established, but it's a very high quality grass. Cattle really like it. Again, you're going to see about 2 pound a gain. That's common with it, maybe a little better. But it has its establishment issues, and there's not really a good spray on the market that we can utilize strictly with it. I know that there's been some people looking at companion crops with it and being able to incorporate a spray that's used on those to try to that works well with Eastern Gamma, but it's not necessarily labeled for Eastern Gamma, and trying to maybe increase or improve that establishment time a little bit better, like what we have with our big blue stem and our Indian grass and plateau. Anyway, that's probably our biggest drawback with Eastern Gamma is I don't know that we really have a good spray to keep that weed control, because that's important with these is putting in is weed control and moisture in the beginning. You have good moisture in the beginning, and you also have good weed control, which we can do very well with big blue stem and Indian grass because we have plateau. We can increase that or reduce that establishment time, that time that it takes to get it going. We can do that pretty well. So, basically, Eastern Gamma is a very high quality grass that and it tolerates wet soils but it does have its establishment issues, but it does perform very well. And it's one of those you want to watch because they'll easily overgraze it because of the quality and the palatability of it as well. Big blue stem is big blue stem and Indian grass have good timing in our production areas. They also mix well, very high palatability, drought tolerant, high quality. This was actually up at Linnaeus some years ago. They did some research where they looked at milk production of beef cows grazing big blue stem versus brome alfalfa pastures, which was pretty good high quality legume cool season grass mix there, and had equivalent milk production between those two groups of cows. So cattle do pretty well on it. This lower point here, this was actually in southern Missouri where they said with NRCS, some people with NRCS did collect some data there looking at big blue stem and over the grazing season, and had upwards of 3 pounds average daily gain over the grazing season. But like I say, a lot of times we're going to be around that 2 range. So they did pretty well as we're stockers. And then some Nebraska data, again, around 2 pounds on that. And then Indian grass is your later producer. It's kind of the end of the scale there. And again, late June, mid and late June is when it's going to be doing well, and again about 2 pound a gain. But it's a very good. It's not good in wet sites. Neither really is big blue stem either. But it mixes well with big blue. Indian grass mixes well with big blue stem. It's a little lower yielding. So, and here's some data with University of Tennessee. I actually do a lot of research. Pat Kaiser works out there, and I know he's done some stuff in the state of Missouri on native warm season grasses, and they do a lot of research out at University of Tennessee related to native warm season grasses. And this is just some data that they had in one of their guide sheets on gain. And you see there, very short grazing period there, they got almost 2.5 pound a gain, but longer grazing periods there, and older animals there, bigger animals, you're back down to that right around 2 pound a gain. And so, and if you look at that picture of it, that's a really nice looking stand of grass that's in Kentucky in July, and see that, and think about what our cool season pastures look like in July. You look at that, would cattle rather be eating that, or would they rather be eating our cool season pastures? And so just something to think about from that standpoint. A little bit of grazing management. And I tried to simplify this. You can read a lot in Tennessee or a lot of articles in Tennessee, and they do look at a lot of grazing on this. And I found a sheet in Kentucky and kind of simplifies it as well, simplifies it a little bit more, but you're really going to start grazing these around 25 inches early season. Like we said, our Eastern Gammon or switchgrass come on a little earlier, so you're probably going to be grazing them a little bit earlier, and your Big Blue and your Indian are going to come on a little later, just depending on the weather. And you want to leave about 8 to 10 inches of stubble, maybe a little bit more if you can. A lot of these paddocks early in the grazing season, you're probably going to be grazing about 2 to 3 days, but you don't want to really stay more than 5 days in a paddock. And you want to plan about 30 to 40 days rest. And so we'll look at our introduced warm seasons here in a little bit, and we don't need that much rest on them. But again, we're not the root structure and everything's different, growing's different, and so it's different. So if you're used to grazing cool seasons, this is a lot different grazing than grazing your cool seasons, because like Terry, I think Terry said this, if you graze them if you graze these natives and you graze some of these warm seasons like you graze your cool seasons, they're not going to stay around because their root structure is not going to stay around, and they won't tolerate the heat and the drought. So this is just really for you to look at. But basically, this was from a MDC document looking at productivity of natives based on soil. So kind of took the middle of the road here, and using that idea, that take half, leave half, looking at how much we need to allocate for cow consumption. On our dry beef cows, they don't need to. I've got a 1,200 pound lactating cow down here. Our dry beef cow is going to eat about 2% of their body weight. Stockers, replacement heifers, going to eat about 3%. So when you allocate, that's kind of what you need to look at. And I just 1,200 pound cows. Some people think they have 1,200 pound cows, and they actually really have 1,400 pound cows. But you kind of have to know what your cows weigh and kind of allocate based on that. And it's not an exact science by any means. A lot of times you're going to allocate, and you just need to kind of watch the forage and see, did I graze it too much, or did I graze it too much, or did I leave too much? And you just kind of have to over time learn that. But when we look at allocation on these, basically, you're looking at 36 pounds of forage and in a take half, leave half scenario, on a normal productive soil, about 4,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds to graze. You're in 36 pounds per head per day on those cows. You could graze during the grazing season about 55 cows per acre per day. And so, and that might be a little tight given if those cows are lactating, they've got calves, those calves are grazing. So it's kind of one of those things you kind of have to watch and see how you do it. You might adjust a little for those calves grazing as well. But and earlier in the season, you're going to have a heavier stocking rate versus later in the season because you're going to have more growth. And so that's more of a grazing talk and probably a whole hour talk or a whole couple hour talk on its own. But just thought I would throw that in there, and down the road, if you have any questions related to that, please let me know. When we look at when do we stop grazing these natives, and I'll show some data later with Bermuda. Terry brought that up. I'll show some data later with Bermuda's, but when do we stop grazing these natives? And the main thing is we look at animal performance. If we notice animal performance is starting to decline, we probably need to pull them. Also, we need to take into account, we need to pull them about 6 weeks prior to our first frost. And so if we take those two things into account, typically late August, early September, we're pulling those cows off or pulling those calves off those natives, because we've got to restore those root reserves. If we don't do that, we're going to affect their stand long term, and we're going to definitely affect it coming back the next year. And so that's just something to keep in mind there as well. And then if you burn, that also gives some time to accumulate prior to fire. Not to say that you have to burn every year, but you do see a little bit of improvement in performance of the forage after burning. But you don't have to burn every year, but that may be something you want to do periodically as well. But that's something you do in the late winter, prior to it coming back on in late winter, early spring, prior to it coming back on. So, so did throw a slide in here about hay management a little bit, and Terry kind of already talked about this, but we need to raise that cutter up, leave about 8 to 10 inches of stubble. Again, your eastern gammon, your switchgrass come on a little earlier, so we probably cut those a little bit earlier versus your big blue stem and your Indian grass. But you don't want to cut, kind of like we said, stop grazing in late August, early September. You don't want to cut this stuff after late August, early September for the same reason. We've got to have that regrowth in there prior to frost so that it can get ready for the winter season, so it can get its root reserves built back up so it's ready for the next growing season. So we look at in our introduced perennials, and that'd be Bermuda grass and Caucasian blue stem and others too. Basically, when we compare them to natives, you can graze them a little later. They provide good late summer forage. Now we'll talk about Bermuda here in a little bit, but we need to watch that. Higher stocking rates. They don't need to rest like the natives do, and you don't have to graze them as tall either. And we'll kind of touch on that a little bit here as well. Now they may invade your natives. They're a little more sensitive to climate because they don't have the deep root structure like the natives do as well. And they do require fertility where the natives are not as fertility dependent. Bermuda grass, Terry kind of touched on a lot of this stuff. Does have some winter hardiness issues. We want to graze it about 4 to 8 inches tall and no lower than 1 to 2 inches. So when you think about cool seasons, that's kind of how you graze cool seasons. And so, and you don't need it near as much rest on the Bermuda grass as you do your natives as well. So, but one thing I do want to touch on, and this is one thing Terry brought up with Bermuda grass. And so, basically, when you look at this graph here, this is a very old research report. It's older than I am. Related to what they did was they looked at average daily gains, digestible dry matter, and digestible protein intake of stockers grazing Midland Bermuda grass in Oklahoma. And that's a common practice in Oklahoma, is to graze Bermuda grass stockers. And as you notice here in the graph, like we said, about 2 pound a gain, that's common. That's what you're going to see there. And May to June was fine. June to July, fine. Then we get to July and August and we see a drop off in gain. And it does kind of recover a little in August and September, but one of the things that we also notice is dry matter intake drops and digestible protein intake drops. And that's one thing you've got to watch on these grasses is their quality. And we'll talk about the Sudans and the pearl millets and those later, the annuals. But we've got to watch quality on these, because if we don't graze these at the right time, and we let them get too mature, and really with any grass, but with Bermuda grass especially, you see the data here. If we let it get too mature and we're not providing that animal, and what they found out was the digestible protein intake was very much a factor here. And to keep this short, because we could go a long time talking about this, but basically this ruminant animal, this cow, the rumen bacteria require digestible protein in order to digest the forage, in order to break it up, in order to convert it into a product that's going to meet the nutrient needs of that animal. And if they are not fed well, if they are not fed properly, if their needs are not met, which protein is important to meet those rumen bacteria's needs, then they're not going to digest the forage properly. If the forage is not digested properly, the intake's not going to be good. If the intake's not going to be good, basically the whole system is shut down and you see poor performance. And so they actually did the analysis on this and that regression analysis, and showed that digestible protein intake decline accounted for a very significant portion of variation in gain. And so that actually led to, a lot of that research led to the fact that we've got on that Bermuda grass and their particular system, they have to supplement protein late in the grazing season so that those cattle can, and that's a common practice in your western states where those forages are poor quality. When past their prime, they need to supplement protein in order to feed those rumen bacteria so that they will then continue to intake those forages, continue to digest those forages, and continue to utilize those forages for proper performance. And so that's something, and we'll see some data on the nutrient values here in a little bit on some of these forages, and they can be very good, but they can also be very bad. And really, if those forages drop below 7%, then we're really sacrificing 7% protein, and we're really sacrificing our intake, or not meeting our rumen bacterial needs, sacrificing our intake and sacrificing our performance. So just to kind of move on here, with Caucasian blue stem, Terry kind of talked about some of this stuff. Again, in Southwest Missouri, they had a 4-year study where they looked at performance on 90 days of grazing, and about 1.5 to 2.5 pounds of gain per head per day over that study. So kind of falls in line with what we've been talking about. Graze these at about 10 to 20 inches down to about 4 to 6 inches. And again, you don't need quite the rest on the Caucasian blue stem that you do on those natives, but maybe a little more than Bermuda grass. And so this is what I was talking about when I said nutrition. And as you can see here on these warm season grasses, they can be very, very high quality protein wise. But they can also be very low quality. And so that's when you've got to watch those in the late season. Don't let them get too mature, graze them properly, or your performance is going to suffer from that standpoint. Our annuals, Terry kind of touched on a lot of this stuff. Main thing is with our Sudan and our sorghum Sudan grass varieties, we have to worry about prussic acid, and if it's a drought, we also have to worry about nitrate, which I'll talk about here in a few slides. And so we don't want to graze those too short, or start grazing those below 24 inches. Or if we've had a drought or a frost, we want to wait at least 14 days. One of the reasons why we don't want to cut them too short is kind of this slide right here. And the thing about it is basically if our stems are more fibrous than our leaves, and if we have more fiber, that's a lower quality forage. And so if we raise our cutter height, we're going to get more leaf and less stem, and that's going to lead to a higher intake forage because there's not as much fiber there to reduce intake. It's also going to lead to more protein. And so we were talking about rumen bacteria earlier. We feed those rumen bacteria more protein. What are they going to do? They're going to eat more. They're going to digest forage better to a certain extent, and they're going to intake, because that forage is being digested better. They're going to get more out of that forage. They're also going to intake more forage. And so more leaf and less stem. The two fibers that we look a lot at are neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. We have more leaf and less stem. Those fiber levels are lower. And if they're lower, that means that our forage is going to be digested better, and we're going to have more intake. And so when you look at raising that cutter height a little bit, or that grazing height, guess what? Those cattle, for one, it yields better, and that partly probably goes back to the roots and the nutrition below the ground versus above the ground. But it also gives you more leaf and less stem in what you are taking off, and so you've got a higher quality forage from that standpoint as well. And so, with that said, that's another reason to raise that cutter height, because you're going to have better quality forage when you're done, or that grazing height. Pearl millet, like sorghum Sudan grass, same type of growing season. You plant those. It doesn't require quite the pH that sorghum Sudan and those require, but production time's the same. We don't have to worry about prussic acid, so we can graze it at a little lower height. But again, we don't want to graze it too short. We want to leave it about 8 to 10 inches. Now, nitrate poisoning, basically why we have nitrate poisoning, it's typically in the low part of the stalk. And why we have it typically is we fertilize, and I'll mention some forage species here in a little bit that typically show it, but it can also happen in other forage species because I've heard of it. And how this happens is we fertilize, and in some instances, if we over fertilize and then there's something that happens that reduces growth, like a drought or shading or cooling or cloudy weather. Those things, the nitrate is still being taken up, but the growth isn't happening to the forage. And if that is happening, which happens a lot in a drought, if we put a lot of fertility on, expecting a lot of growth, but then we have a drought come in and that doesn't happen, then we can have nitrate issues because that nitrate's still being taken up. Now, the animal can convert nitrate and typically converts nitrate to ammonia. But what happens when we have nitrate poisoning in the animal is we overload the system with nitrate, and instead of it going to ammonia, it goes to nitrite. And nitrite is toxic to the animal. It affects the blood carrying capacity of oxygen. And basically what happens is if we have too much nitrate in the animal, the blood doesn't carry oxygen and tissue suffocate, the animal dies. And so that's and we have treatments for that. It's probably better to try to prevent it, because a lot of times when people notice that they have a nitrate issue in their animals, it's too late and they're past the point of being able to be helped. Or it could be a very mild case, and in the case of bred cows, a very mild case, and you can see a lot of abortions and things like that. So that's kind of the two ends of the spectrum. But a lot of times when I hear of nitrate poisoning or nitrate being an issue, it's usually cattle that are not used to grazing that particular forage. They're hungry, they've been turned in on it, and then the person who turned them in on it goes out and sees some dead cows. And that's back when we had our droughts and people were looking for forage to feed, and they had this, whether it was corn stalks or whatever, that you heard a lot of that. And so but it can be as mild as cows losing pregnancy, even at a small dose, and we'll see that here in the next slide. But your typical plants that cause nitrate poisoning are going to be your sorghum sedans, your milos, your Johnson grass, pearl millet, corn, and weeds. Basically, the best option here is to reduce the incidence of it. There is ways to treat it, but your better option is to reduce the incidence of it. And that's where Terry mentioned a little bit. We can test certain feeds or plants that we might think have it, and adjust that feeding strategy accordingly. Dilution in the diet, and that's one thing our state beef cattle nutrition extension specialist talks a lot about, is providing some carbohydrate or some fermentable carbohydrate, something to kind of dilute that down and work with that rumen and get that rumen working. And that can help a little bit as well. And then another thing, if you have the option to ensile those particular forages like silage, a lot of times we have drought stressed corn and it doesn't make a crop. And so what do we do with it? We want to feed it to cows. One way to help, if it's drought stressed and it's probably high in nitrate a little bit, one way to reduce that is to ensile that crop. And that can reduce that amount by a third to a half. And a lot of times, if you ensile it, it's probably going to be all right to feed. So, but it's very important, if you're going to do something like that, you need to test it prior to feeding. And really, one of the things that we see a lot of issue with this possibly is second growth corn. And if you're going to graze corn, stubble, or things like that, you probably want to test that and make sure that that's not high in nitrate as well. So this slide, you can look at this later date, but this just kind of shows the concentrations and percentages, and kind of what you need to be looking for, what's high and what's acceptable. If it's over 0.25%, basically it's you're going to have to adjust the ration in some way, shape, or form. There where I talked about pregnant and young animals, even at low levels above that 0.25%, those animals can be affected a little bit. And then if you get over 1.5%, you probably shouldn't be feeding it to any animals. But this is something that if you have an issue with this, talk with your local livestock field specialist, and they can work with you on and trying to figure out how to feed this feed resource if this becomes an issue. So, and you've got my contact information. If you ever have any questions on this, just contact me at a later date and we'll talk about it. So, crabgrass. And so now we're kind of moving to the annuals. And crabgrass is one of those. I was actually out at a farm the other day and we were talking about, it's one of those that will seed in with tall fescue and will do pretty well there. It comes in a little later. Problem is it probably works better to keep it by itself because you can manage it better. But it is one of those, like if you're limited on pasture space, it is one of those that you can incorporate in with tall fescue and probably be all right. It's just you're going to have a hard time managing it and keeping it around as more than an annual because of that being able to graze it or being able to get the cattle off of it and let it reseed. But it's very drought tolerant, heat tolerant. It grows in the summer when a lot of things won't grow. Graze it around 14 inches. Don't graze it lower than 3 inches. Then you've got annual Lespedeza, and it's another very good high quality. It's a legume. Legumes typically have more leaf and less stem than your grasses, and so they're higher quality because, as I talked about earlier, that leaf and that stem. If we get more leaf and less stem, we don't have as much fiber, and if we don't have as much fiber, we can get more intake and more protein and more digestibility out of those forages. And so, legume versus grass, and we've got alfalfa here in a little bit, which is a very high quality legume. But from a Lespedeza standpoint, this is another one that mixes well with your cool season grasses. It's not going to be like your clovers. It doesn't fix nitrogen like your clovers. It doesn't have the quality that your clovers have. It's a little stemmier, a little bit harsher from that standpoint, but it is a good legume, and it will provide you some grazing there in that late summer. And if you want to use it in hay, it works in there too. So, but it is good legume, late summer grazing legume. One of the problems with it is it does get crowded out. If you improve it gets crowded out by those higher yielding grasses under higher fertility. And so, but it does grow on lower quality, lower pH soils. So, and then alfalfa from a beef cow standpoint, from a grazing standpoint, it may, now if you're doing stockers, it probably works. If you're doing just cows, I probably may not go with alfalfa because of the high, you may not need quite that nutrition, quite that amount of nutrition. Now, I knew some dairy grazing operations who incorporated alfalfa into that, and of course they need that nutrition for those dairy cows. But and if you're running stockers, it's probably a good idea. But you need to manage it like a cash crop or a hay crop from a grazing standpoint. When you start grazing it early to mid bud stage, and you need to do that about every 30 days, just like you would if you were baling it for hay. Because if you don't do that, it's not going to it's not going to stay good. And you can have some bloat issues with it from a grazing standpoint, because it's a very high digestible, low dry matter, especially if it's got dew and moisture on it. And that can lead to some bloat issues, especially if the cattle aren't used to it. If you're grazing it alone, and that's typically in the early morning when it's high moisture and low dry matter, and it's a very highly digestible, high protein feed stuff on its own. And so bloat inhibitor, paloxylene blocks, you can put that in supplement as well. And you don't want to turn hungry animals in on it. But again, about 2 pound a gain. This was from Gary Lacefield's, been retired a while from the University of Kentucky, but works really well in a stocker setup for beef cattle operations. So to kind of wrap this up, basically what our warm season grasses do is they fill that cool season grass slump, basically. And we've got some limitations. There's some things to think about, and I mentioned those in the beginning. Is establishment time, persistence. Some of these require their own field. Some of these don't require their own field. Some of these are annuals. Some of these stay around a while. Those are things to think about. Can we incorporate them into a lot of us have cool season fields, and probably our best option to get these in and start using them is probably to figure out how we incorporate something into our cool season fields, because that's what we have. Maybe a longer term goal is to maybe incorporate, or maybe as we renovate some pastures, maybe bring some of those into maybe some perennial warm season fields. And then maybe bring some cool season annuals back into those. But those are things you've got to think about, and an agronomist or a livestock specialist would be very good to talk to related to that. Some grazing management is different with the warm seasons versus the cool seasons, and then really you've got to look at it from a dollars and cents standpoint. We're really only going to get 4 months of grazing out of these. When we look at the cost, are we putting the right kind of animals on those warm seasons that we can get the right kind of return to pay for those warm seasons? And that's something you've got to look at in your operation and think about that. And like I said, I think they work well if you're doing a spring calving operation, a stocker operation, a custom grazing or a grass finished operation possibly. I wonder about a cool season calving operation, because again, at that time of the year, those cows, if the calves are gone, those cows don't have that high of a nutrient need at that time of the year. But and basically when we look at the end of the day, whether it's cool season, warm season grasses on our operation, we've got to put forages. If we can provide forages to them, that's our cheapest feed resource for the most part, and grazing those forages. And what we've got to do on our cattle operation is to incorporate those forages in so that we provide the most efficient feed resources to meet those cattle nutrient needs. And that goes back to what your operation has, what you're raising, and looking at those nutrient needs and incorporating those forages in to provide them the cheapest, the most efficient feed resources. So with that, I want to thank you all for being on tonight. And are there any questions before we end for the evening?
There is none in the chat box.
Okay. Not anybody have any questions? Not hearing any questions. Again, I want to thank you for being on. I want to thank Terry for providing his presentation this evening, and you've got our contact information. I'll get Terry's slides and I will send them to you. You do have the evaluation. Please fill that out and send that back to us. And if you ever have any questions or anything, just let us know and we'll try to answer them as best we can. And I will send the recorded video that'll be sent out hopefully tomorrow. So with that, thank you again for being on, and hopefully we'll talk to you later.
Patrick, you
Thanks,
need anything else from me?
No, thanks, Terry. If you just want to, when you get some internet, just send me those slides and I'll send them out to them. So,
Okay, I'm gonna sign off.
okay, thank you.